Hello, welcome back to day 2 of the next 6 months when management guru Mark Thomas, hello Mark, tells us what's going on and are we ever going to get back to normal? Before we ask you that big question, Mark, there's a lot of talk at the moment about austerity. Here in the UK, we've lived through decades of austerity. What I fear is that we're going to be faced with the same thing again with all the cost of COVID and so on. Tell us about austerity and what it's all about, please.
Well, austerity essentially is a serious sounding word for cutting public spending. Okay. And as you say, we have had quite a lot of it in the UK, and it's had some really nasty effects. So, we've seen schools underfunded, we've seen benefits underfunded, we've seen nurses effectively having a pay cut every year because their pay rise hasn't kept pace with inflation. We've seen a huge number of consequences, rising poverty, etc., all driven by austerity.
Okay, but let me just stop you there. It would appear from sort of basic economics, I suppose, that if you run up a huge credit card bill, you're going to have to pay for it at some point. And isn't that the same basically with national economies?
It's actually not the same. Politicians very often use the analogy of a household or a corner shop to explain the national economy, but there are some very big differences between the two. The most obvious one is that if you're a government, our government, for example, owns the Bank of England, which means it effectively has a printing press. It can create money whenever it needs to. And the Bank of England has, since the global financial crisis, created 745 billion. That's basically 3/4. Yes, exactly.
That's quite a credit card bill.
That's quite a credit card bill, created 750 billion of new money, which they've used largely to buy government debt. So of the high level of government debt that we have today, more than a third of it is money that the government owes to the Bank of England, which is part of the government. So it's rather as if I owe money to myself, and then I say, well, I owe myself £1 million, so I'm sorry, Peter, but I can't afford to pay you anything.
That's extraordinary. I never knew that. It sounds like a massive great con trick. So why on?
Well, it is a con trick.
Why aren't the people out in the street sort of saying, open up our libraries again because we can afford it. We've got the money.
Because most people haven't been told that. The story that you just told me is a very widely told and constantly retold story. And just the other day, Rishi Sunak did a little
tell everybody who he is. Not every international viewer will know who he is.
No, that's true. He's the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he's the most senior person in finance in the UK government. Right. And he did a little presentation explaining in a very calm, serious-sounding way that there are actually only two ways that government can spend. One is it can tax, and the other one is it can borrow. And if it borrows, just as you said, it has to pay it back later. So sooner or later, it all comes down to tax. And therefore, we just can't afford to keep spending like this.
Right. So what you're saying is...
that story sounds persuasive.
It sounds very persuasive until the scales fall from my eyes. And I've just understood for the first time, I think, that what we're being told is not based on economics, it's based on ideology. Is that right?
It's absolutely right. And there are two other reasons why it's a lie, essentially. That's the first one. The second one is debt isn't high now. We keep being told that debt's at unprecedentedly high levels.
Yeah, I thought it was.
Well, have a look at this chart.
I've got a chart
which
here, okay. Yeah,
see if we can get this up. The Bank of England has very kindly provided information for this one. And this is therefore publicly available. Anyone can know this, but actually the bit of the picture you normally get shown is that little rectangle on the bottom right.
On the bottom, okay. So you're going to have to talk us through this, Mark, because it's way above my pay grade. What are we looking at here?
So here we're looking at the ratio of debt to GDP. So how much does the government owe as a percentage of the country's GDP, as a percentage of the size of the economy, in other words. So you can see, if you look at this little bit on the bottom right in the shaded rectangle, that it's gone up in recent years from well under 50%, and it's now probably just about 100%. And we keep being told that, well, this is ruinous, this will need to be paid back, our children and their children will still be paying for this, and that's irresponsible, so we need to cut spending now. And that's just complete nonsense, because when you look at the rest of the graph, what you can see is that it's not particularly high now. Even if at 100%, even if it were at 150%, which is nowhere near, that's still not particularly high.
That's
1820 was.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary. So 1820 was the time when the Industrial Revolution was just about to kick off. Debt to GDP then was over 200%. But of course, that was a hugely successful period. And just before the golden age of capitalism that we talked about last time, which was the period from the end of the Second World War up to 1980, you can see just before that kicked off, it was over 250%. So our two most successful periods in history happened immediately after periods of very, very high debt. There's no argument that high debt is an obstacle to high growth. Not in our history. In fact, if you look at the 300 years on a rather different way of looking at it, you can see the only way we've ever reduced debt to GDP is by having high growth. And austerity doesn't produce high growth. So
what does austerity produce?
Austerity produces a shrinkage of the state and an increase in inequality. If you happen to be well into the top 1% of the population, that's quite good news, because the inequality works in your favor. The pie may not grow very much, but your slice increases. But if you're in the bottom 99%, which of course 99% of people are by definition, and always will be by definition, then increases in inequality mean you get poorer.
Okay, so it feels to me as if we've been conned, that people have been sold a line, and we are getting poorer. Our children, as we discussed yesterday, are not going to be as wealthy as we are, which seems a very strange state of affairs indeed. And meanwhile, the top 1% just get far richer than they have done in any other economic period. Am I right?
Well, you're right that that's the track we're on. We're firmly on that track. And if we don't change track, then what you've described, I think, is what will happen. But there's nothing to stop us changing track.
Okay, how do we do that?
Well, we need to change policy. So the dominant policy, of course, over the last 10 years has been austerity, and that's manifested in 1,000 bad decisions, cutting all sorts of things that we should be spending on, which are good for everybody. So the first thing is to, realize that we can change policy. So we're actually saying there should be five changes to make sure that we actually govern for the 99%. And the first of those is a democratic reset, to make it an explicit legal duty of the government to govern on behalf of the whole population, not a tiny, wealthy segment of the population.
Yes. Yeah.
The second
go on. Yeah, I'm fascinated. Go on.
Second one also relates to what we've been talking about, which is that we need policy to be based on facts, not myths. So we've just been talking about how this whole notion of extreme debt forcing austerity was a myth. We can't afford to have myth-based policy. We need fact-based policy. And then the last three are about the types of policy, essentially saying that we need to have policies, we need to find a way, and we can talk about this another day, we need to find a way to grow the pie faster and to share it more fairly, we need to invest in the future, and we need to clean up capitalism. Those are the five.
Whoa, is that saying that all that before tea, hopefully?
Exactly.
This is enlightening, terrific stuff, Mark. You clearly know your onions. Tomorrow we're going to be back with you again. If you've got questions for management guru Mark Thomas, the author of 99%, I think that's about you and me. And it was one of the Financial Times Book of the Year. If you've got questions, just leave them down below in the questions and comments section here on YouTube. And we'll see you tomorrow.